Hi, I'm back with the next couple of chapters of The Dry Wood by Caryll Houselander. We're going to do chapter 19, The Stations of the Cross. The opening quote: "If he come to me, I shall not see him. If he depart, I shall not understand." Job, chapter 9, verse 11. War came closer and closer, gripping and constricting the mind with iron fingers of fear. People going about their daily work fell asleep in tubes or buses, anywhere at all where they were relaxed for a few minutes. Timothy observed how sleeping faces reveal what waking faces hide. Asleep, everyone had something of a child, sometimes in the unguarded features, sometimes in the open hands or the abandonment of the body, or perhaps simply because when they were asleep they were defenseless, all equally defenseless. From the large, square-faced laborer with his bag of tools, who slumped over sideways, his head hanging towards his shoulder, to the little old lady in black kid gloves who sat bolt upright asleep, looking even a little whiter in the face than when she was awake, her head nodding under her hat that resembled a piled-up plate of black vegetables. They slept because the sorrow, the foreboding, that oppressed them exceeded that which human nature could bear. In sheer self-defense, they must slip away into a sweet, dark oblivion. Timothy thought of Gethsemane and the apostles sleeping for sorrow. This too was the eve of Christ's passion, and men and women were sleeping for sorrow. He himself wrestled with the dread of what it must mean for him, above all, the dread of army life. He was built for solitude, for the long, still, meditative nights alone. Now to hand himself over, body and soul, like a child going back to school, to army life, seemed an intolerable thought. He put off any decision and found 1,000 reasons for complicating and increasing the conflict. Eric Jacobs behaved like a wild bird in a cage, dashing from one side to the other, bruising himself on both. One day aggressive, violent in his condemnation of Germany, the next day a pacifist, attacking his friends who humiliated him by volunteering to fight. His desperate fear and need for someone to reassure him caused him to forget that Timothy was a Catholic, and to forget the isolation he had helped to inflict upon him. He was in his room now, as of old, talking. Then, suddenly, quite unexpectedly, he turned up in uniform. He explained, somewhat sheepishly, that there seemed no other way for him. The bookshop where he worked was closing down, and the food in the army was abundant. He was leaving the next day. This was goodbye. Timothy asked him if he had seen Peter and the others. Yes, and there everything was tragic. They were all foreigners and misfits. Not one of them knew what would become of him. Timothy asked if Peter would like to see him. Eric thought not. He was proud. He would not relent because of his own trouble. He would never accept pity. The nights were sinister. All through the hours of darkness, the heavy, ominous sound of armored traffic, lorries, guns, passing through London in an unbroken procession, denying the faint hope the newspapers proclaimed. On Eric's last night, Timothy heard a young man, someone unknown to him, cry out in a half-strangled voice from a window nearby, I can't! It seemed to give a voice to the agony of London, to reveal it like the tearing off of a bandage from a wound. It broke through the night, splitting it, and then ceased as suddenly. And until light came, the rattle of the procession of guns went on with its terrifying official secrecy under cover of darkness. The next day, very early in the morning, Timothy's landlady brought him a note from Eric. "Mr. Jacobs has gone," she said. "He seemed properly upset, and he told me to warn you there is bad news in his note. He couldn't bring himself to wait and tell you. He went away an hour before he had need to." "All right, put it down there." The landlady lingered, waiting with an appetite for disaster. "You had better go," Timothy said. "Whatever it is, I shall have to dress." "I thought," she said, with a little sniff of wounded vanity, "I might help." "If I want you, I can come to you," said Timothy brutally. She went out, slamming the door. He heard her indignation in her flouncing retreat, the heels of her bedroom slippers banging out their protest like clappers on the carpetless stairs. He sat staring at what was written on the piece of paper in his hand, hardly able to take in what it meant. "Peter is in St. Jude's Hospital. He tried to kill himself." He did not know if Peter was alive or dead now, if he would want him to come or not. He only knew that he must go to him. The hospital seemed quite unreal, so undisturbed, so matter-of-fact, so clean and shining and white, so full of air and light. No one questioned him. He went straight in and began to look for Peter in the wards. The patients stared, and a young nurse came up to him. "Is Peter Lukarski here?" "Well, now, would it be an accident?" "Yes, no, not exactly." He stopped because he could not bear it in his own voice, but he must. "He tried to commit suicide." "Oh, yes, I know now whom you want, the emergency ward. But are you a relation? Were you sent for? This is not a visiting hour." "I must see him." "Well, I will ask Sister." Sister was large and square, with immense teeth and a huge bunch of keys at her waist, which caused her to rattle like an oilless machine when she moved. A kind but masterful woman who had complete mastery not only over her own feelings, but over other people's. Everything in the mill of her authority was ground and sifted to a kind of milled grain of common sense. Life and death even lost their drama in her milling. A patient was as comfortable as can be expected, unless he were actually at death's door, when he was not quite so comfortable. She looked kindly at Timothy. "You are a friend of Mr. Lukarski?" "Yes." "Then perhaps you can tell us if he has any relations?" "Not here. I never heard of any, but tell me, will he die?" "Oh, no. The surgeon had to put in a few stitches. But he is fairly comfortable. He is still under the anesthetic. The danger is that if he has not got the will to live, he may try to tear off his bandage. They do that. Later on, he will have the help of a psychiatrist. Sometimes that does them good." She spoke as if suicide were as common as measles. "You may come and have a look at him, and perhaps in a day or two you can have a little chat with him." "Sister, we had quarreled. At least, he had quarreled with me. He might not want to see me when he comes round." "Dear me, what a pity. Well, you may go in now for a few minutes." Peter was behind screens. He was very near waking and was breathing quietly, as if he was sleeping naturally. He had a bandage round his throat. Timothy stood looking down at him. He had never before known such strong, composed love for anyone as he knew now for his friend. He lay there before his eyes, the symbol of youth in a faithless world, defeated, lost, in his own will, destroyed. Timothy knew that this love that flowed through him like a torrent was the love of the church, the love of Christ in his church for the soul that was lost. It was the love for which all the fanfare and splendor of the hierarchy was maintained, the love that was in the unique loneliness of the vicar of Rome, in the daily struggle of the parish priests, in the immolation of the contemplatives, the love in a million masses being offered at that very moment, lifted up in the blood ringed in a million golden cups, proved in the breaking of a million hosts. It was the love in the sacrifices of multitudes of little children, of legions of holy old nuns, the love in the aching knees of armies of charwomen, in the wrestling with sin of legions of the tempted. It was the love of the saints and the sinners through the centuries, flowing through his heart like a mighty river. It was the love of Christ on the cross, the river of life flowing out of his heart at the moment of his death, the bloodstream of the life of the world. All the sermons, all the teaching, all the admonition, all the counsel and tender whispered hope in the church, all the counsel and tender whispered hope in the church was meant for Peter. But how would it ever reach him? Timothy looked at his white, closed face. He saw how pinched his nose was, how white his mouth, and the lobes of his ears, bloodless and white. His ears looked like wax. His ears looked like open wax flowers, but they were deaf to the eloquence, the pleading, the threatening of the multitudinous voice of love, deaf equally to the Dies Irae and to the tender pleadings of the Lamb. And then Timothy remembered. Peter had not been deaf to the misery of human creatures. It was because he had tried to love alone that he had despaired. He was the pitiful, logical answer to the absolute statement, "Without me, you can do nothing." But, thought Timothy, if Christ is true to his word, he cannot perish. And he prayed for Peter. And then he knew he must answer to the prayer, he himself. The love of the church, of Christ in his mystical body, could reach even this closed heart, even this voluntary outcast. The loneliness of the Vatican, the labors of the apostles, the thorny crown of the theologians, the bravery of the children, the sacrifices of the poor could reach him through his own love. It could only be through contemplation. Now, very quietly and gently, as words and incidents return in dreams, the images evoked by the conversation at Monsignor Frayne's dinner party came back to him. The child who showed Christ's love to the poor as the crucifix showed it to the monks in their cells. He was looking on another crucifix now, on the crucifix that was Peter Lukarski, who had crucified Christ in his own soul. Well, that was an insight. He thought of the contemplative in his cell, standing not in front of a painted cross, but in front of a white wall, himself cruciform, his arms extended, his hands empty, his naked feet still, his heart broken open for his Lord's sorrows. He had become like the crucified, on whom he looks always with the dark eye of faith, because he cannot help becoming like one on whom he gazes steadily forever. Stripped of everything, empty-handed, because the arms stretched out wide enough to embrace the crucified reach out to the width that embraces the world and hug nothing to self, because the hands open to receive the nails must let go that hold of all else. Now Timothy knew that in order to offer himself for Peter, he too must be a contemplative. He too must take on the shape of Christ. He also must look on this living crucifix and be shaped into the pattern of Christ crucified in this man. Peter had tried to take his life. Timothy must offer his life, give it back to God, that Peter might have life everlasting. He made his offering, speaking softly to Peter. Peter, I will offer my life for you, but my life is nothing. I will offer Christ in my life for you. I'm going away now to try to imitate him and to offer him in my life and death for you. He knew that Peter could not hear, but God heard, and a thought came to him that was almost blinding in its tragic glory. Christ, he thought, is man's contemplative. He looked at him and loved him and became like him and took on the shape and color of his sins, the shape of the cross, the color of his stripes and blood. The sister came in. "Doing nicely," she said, with a shrewd glance at Peter, and speaking of him as if he were the Christmas turkey in the oven. "And now, I think you must leave him for today." Outside, the pale primrose of early morning had warmed into a soft blue day of benediction and light. Timothy went to the Lady Chapel of the nearest church. He asked Our Lady to look after the details of Peter's life, and then, suddenly very weary, knelt for a time silent, the shame of what the human race had done to her and her little son aching in him. He knelt as if he were a child who buries his crimson face of shame in his mother's wide skirt. Then he went to a call box and rang his office. "Will you take a message to the editor? Thank you. I shall not be coming today. I'm going to enlist. Goodbye." A queue of young men were lined up before him, come out of all manner of lives to the hazard of this new, strange life of abnegation. Some wistful city clerks, pale, round-shouldered, escaping from the squirrel's cage. Some countrymen, big and ruddy, wanting perhaps to seize on the world with their large hands, instead of day after day seizing the same warm hollow in the handle of the plough. Some lads hardly out of school, and others who looked like convicts and were taking their biggest chance. Inside, it seemed to Timothy as if he were taking part in a pathetic pageant of the Stations of the Cross. One by one, the men stood before the officer, who looked them up and down, asked a few questions, condemned them to probable death. One by one, they were stripped for the medical examination and stood, pitifully, childlike in their nakedness, immolated men. And then they were given soldiers' clothes, and on the big men, and then they were given soldiers' clothes, and even on the big men, they seemed to sag and to be a mockery. Perhaps in a few months they would fill them. Perhaps the clothes would have wed themselves to the men, and the men would be soldiers. At present, they looked incongruous and ludicrous. His own turn came, and the misery of self-consciousness of an oversensitive schoolboy came back to him. He felt that his shrinking mind was exposed in his thin body, that it would glare out of his ribs that he preferred poetry to football. He hated the soldier's coat, but it covered his nakedness. He walked back when it was over to take his place among the other recruits. Excuse me. And the sound of his heavy army boots on the wooden floor sickened him with its association with school. He sat down in the row waiting for orders and began to watch the others. to try to see below the masks of their faces, to know them from their hands, the delicate shoulders' hands. The delicate scholar's hands, the broad, efficient hands of the craftsman, all held out for the nail, he thought. And he thought, too, how strange it is that it is our flesh and blood, these bodies, that Christ uses for his purpose of love, as he used common bread for the sacrament of his body. Poor bodies of men, broken, twisted, drained, ugly, and Christ present where they are. The incarnation is everywhere. He felt peaceful and ready now to wait for orders. He knew that he had only been able to volunteer as a soldier because he recognized no man living as his enemy, because his offering for his friend was equally and inevitably an offering for the whole world, Germans and Englishmen alike. He had laid bare his heart. Wow. That's chapter 19. Okay. The next chapter is called The Archbishop Dozes. I'm glad we're going back to the Archbishop. He's great. I've noticed that there are views on this. Is somebody watching these? I will finish the book. We're very close. So we have 20. I think we have 2 more. Okay, yeah. They're short chapters though. But what is it? 24? Yep. We're beginning chapter 20, and there are 24 chapters in the book. So Chapter 20. The Archbishop Dozes. As arrows in the hand of the mighty, so the children of them that have been shaken. Psalm 126, verse 4. The Archbishop paced slowly to and fro, up and down his room, and at last sank down gratefully into an armchair. He lately felt more and more conscious that he was now a really old man, a consciousness which came to him rather gently and pleasantly than otherwise, perhaps because the habit of his mind was gracious and his heart grateful. He was becoming increasingly aware of kindness all about him. People were kind, and things, too. His armchair was inviting and comfortable. His lamp was shaded and shed a soft radiance. He was conscious of and grateful for the countless details of life that daily eased the aching of his mind and body. Perhaps he needed more consideration, more help from his environment than he used to do. It was how God was teaching him in his own way to be humble and to receive the sweetness of his love. What a beautiful meditation on age. He smiled, thinking of how he, as a young man, coveted the life of a monk, and at that a contemplative, how he had longed for the narrow cell and the white wall and the freedom of being no one and having nothing. How differently God had chosen, who, because the young man's shoulders were said to be too frail for the hair shirt and the scourge, had laid upon them at length the far heavier cross of a bishopric. with its needs and debts, and its ignorance and its slums, with its aspirations and failures and quarrels. He frowned. Nothing distressed him so much as discord, above all, discord, however trivial and however permissible the matter, among his clergy. Above all, discord, however trivial and however permissible the matter, among his clergy. And recently there had been a great deal of it. It was an astonishing thing, he thought, what a lot of trouble that good old Father Malone had always managed to cause him. And even death had not ended it. In his lifetime he was blunt and no respecter of persons, likely therefore to be adored and feared, loved and hated. But he had been, as the Archbishop remembered him, without faults. For in his mind, candor was no fault, or single-heartedness, or devotion to his flock. He was said, too, to have had great spiritual insight, and to have told people on more than one occasion some disconcerting truths concerning themselves, which of course would have to be very carefully considered should his cause be introduced. Monsignor Frayne, who, the Archbishop reflected with a sigh, did not cease to worry poor old Father Malone's memory as a dog worries a bone, triumphantly cited cases of persons of holy reputation whose holiness had been pricked like a bubble when it was discovered that they had informed certain pious ladies that they were stepping rapidly on the downward path and were labeled for hell. No matter that anyone with half an eye could have seen that these good ladies were on the way to hell, no one could know their eternal destiny, and no one who professed to could qualify for sainthood. The Archbishop had smiled. There was, of course, no evidence at present that Father Malone had committed any ladies, pious or impious, to hell, or that he had claimed or revealed any kind of supernatural power in his candid warnings. These might have been irritating, not because of any unusual power in perceiving the particular faults, but because of his unusual honesty in stating them. Then, said Monsignor Frayne, was this honesty consistent with charity? There's a little bit of Monsignor Frayne in all of us, I'm afraid. I think. Maybe just me. The Archbishop shrugged his thin shoulders. An examination into all the circumstances alone could decide that point. Some canonized saints had recoiled openly in the presence of certain people because of the stench of their sins. There may have been some who would have questioned the charity of that before their canonization. The Archbishop stretched out his hand and opened and closed his fingers, as if he were a beggar accepting an alms of the frozen gold of the pale sunshine. His hand was transparent and very old, like a thin autumn leaf, and his face, too, was very old and very tired. Ever before his mind's eye now was a vision of the people of the world arming for war, and his soul, moved with compassion, cried out for peace. Yet even here, in his little diocese, men quarreled. Holy men quarreled over holiness. Men who ate the same divine bread and drank of the same chalice quarreled over sanctity. Men who loved God quarreled over the love of God. How petty it seemed. And yet, the Archbishop began to turn the thing over and over in the fine filter of his mind. Was it pettiness, or simply part of the immense issue being fought out in the whole world? The immense issue which had indeed divided and tortured the world in one form or another since the coming of Christ. The war between the masses, the vast groups of men, and the individual man. Between the armed, organized, unthinking multitudes with their puppet leaders who were with their puppet leaders, who were the personification of the demons that had drawn them together. Leaders who were driven by the unrecognized evil in those whom they were said to lead, and tossed along on the storm of their passions like pebbles on a storm-racked sea, and the lonely individual men who remained solitary in the crowd. Nowadays, he thought sadly, there are very few who dare to be alone, very few who do not join the crowd, and he saw in his thoughts the crowds outside the house of Pilate who shouted out, "Crucify him!" and the crowds on the Via Crucis, following the loneliest man in the world with shouts and insults on his way to death. How many of those men, he asked, would have consented to his death if they had been alone, if they had not been one of a crowd? And how many today are consenting to his death in Europe, in the whole world, because they are one of a crowd, one of a great group, one of a mechanized group like a machine? Power, might, the pride of life, power, might, the pride of life, those things never stood alone, never dared to stand alone, and dared not stand against the guilt and misgiving even in themselves. They needed the reassurance of countless others like them, dressing like them, speaking like them, acting like them, convincing them that wrong is right because the great all and everyone does wrong. Evil, like the devil, is named Legion. And those who stand for humility, thought the Archbishop, are alone. On this earth, lonely. Those who hold through the ages to the old conventions of holiness that Mother Church teaches in her nursery, humility, poverty, the mortification of the senses, lowliness, they are alone, he thought, even among their own kith and kin, among those who share their faith and whom they love. And again, men of good will learn only by striving with sanctity, are healed of their own infirmities only by dashing themselves against the rock of holiness. He thought how the saints have always been alone and lonely on earth because they held on with aching fingers to the hard, simple facts of the gospel, the uncompromising holiness of Christ, because they saw the changeless vision through unshed tears, and heard the voice of love through the world's din, be it the clash of swords, the humming of machines, or the thunder of guns. I have looked for one who would sorrow together with me and have found no one. Wherever they had been in the world, wherever time or place or circumstance, they had been alone. He thought of dear... Excuse me. He thought of dear Saint Elizabeth in her golden crown, clothed in ermine and crimson over the hair shirt, lonely among the illustrious who loved her. Of Bernadette in her patched cotton dress and coarse woolen stockings, isolated from her simple peasant family by her vision. Of Joan of Arc in her armor and her tunic of heavenly blue and silver fleur-de-lis, lonely on the field of battle among the soldiers who adored her. The door opened and the Archbishop's secretary came in. He had a bundle of letters in his hand and he put down on the table. "We still have letters about Riverside every day," he said. The novena is stirring up an absurd amount of feeling. Some implore your lordship to make an end of it, while others have the effrontery to ask you to join in." The Archbishop smiled. "And perhaps it does not occur to these good people that I cannot give orders to the Holy Ghost?" "No, I do not think that even Monsignor Frayne has thought of that. His strong line is that the local communists are encouraging the cult. Devotion to a saintly Catholic priest? Yes, on the grounds that poverty was his strong line, that he was essentially one of the people. They lay great stress on a supposed contrast between his life and that of some of the West End clergy, even of certain religious orders, based, of course, on a misconception of our religion. Of course, Father. But intended as a subtle way of splitting the loyalty of the faithful, at what is, of course, a most critical point of the world's history. It is so fantastic, Father. It is so fantastic, Father, and so certain to fade out, that but for one thing I should give no heed to the matter at all. But that thing is the possibility of even one soul suffering harm by it. But I am afraid no ruling that I could make would in any way influence the communists. In the opinion of Monsignor Frayne, said the secretary, the remedy is a positive Catholicism run on the communist lines, using the sword that the communists have forged against themselves: culture, art, science, politics, organization, above all a strong, enthusiastic youth movement. He's right indeed, said the Archbishop. But all this must come from the heart of the people. It must grow up spontaneously out of the roots of them as the wheat grows up out of the earth. It cannot be imposed upon them from above. We cannot organize the Holy Ghost. No, Your Grace, but even the wheat must be sown before it grows. Truly, Father, but by the wind of the Spirit. The seed that we humble priests can plant, or perhaps it is only the fertilizer that we can put upon the seed that the wind has sown, is the preaching of the love of our Savior Jesus Christ. When all is said and done, Father, the seed is his blood. The secretary bowed his head and went out of the room. The Archbishop closed his eyes. He supposed that he would be constrained to give a lead if this miracle that the people of Riverside were praying for was granted. In one way, the miracle would be an answer. In another way, however, it would be the beginning of more controversy. He closed his eyes and prayed to the Holy Spirit to flood his mind with light. The afternoon sun shone through his thin, closed lids, and his mind drifted back to an evening where he had sat out after an early dinner in the walled garden of a convent. In spite of the unrest in the world and the continual hammering of its grief on his mind, he was at peace. Indeed, on that evening, one might have supposed it impossible that there could be anything else but peace anywhere. Silence possessed the garden. The thin green leaves were saturated with gold. Earlier in the day, a bee had droned. Birds had sung. There had been children's voices in the distance and the faint, reassuring sound of crockery being washed up, coming from the open windows of the house. Now there was absolute stillness. Silence more positive than sound. No droning, no singing of birds, no voices of children, no sounds from the house. The flowers and leaves were motionless, as if they were carved out of jade and ivory. The garden was breathless, listening. This stillness, this intense stillness, was like a pause in which music is the link between a long passage of melody and a sudden dominating discord. It broke in the large harshness of a sinister voice, hoarse, dominating and grating across the stillness. First one voice and then a chorus speaking as mechanically as one. Krieg, Krieg, Krieg! War, war, war! It was the voice of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi youth. Someone inside the house had turned on the wireless to listen to Hitler's speech in Germany. Then the Archbishop tasted the grief of the whole world. He was certain now that nothing could stop war. Far away in Germany, from the fanatical heart of exploited youth, the cry went up that split the world and broke the heart of an old man sitting quietly in England in a garden of jade and ivory. Krieg! 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 War! 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 The mental image that had impressed itself on his mind then came back to him now in a dream, for he had fallen asleep. A multitudinous army of robot children, armed children, fierce, mechanical, soulless. A robot army marching from end to end of the earth, marching with loud, metallic, rhythmic sound, unable to stop, unable to slow the pace, unable to turn back. Power, strength, force, the armed pride of life. What force could oppose it? Could any legion of flesh and blood destroy pride? Even if it could defeat the pitiful army of robot children on the field of battle, could it destroy pride? Or would that only have changed hands to march on and on, gathering its recruits from the whole world, on and on and on, to the destruction of humanity? Another memory entered the Archbishop's dream and was merged into it, a memory of the day on which Monsignor Frayne had come to him with his fair-haired young secretary to warn him of the part that little Willie Jewell would play in the devotion to old Father Malone. In his dream he heard again the sound that he had listened to on that evening, the tramping of the workers in the street as they went in their multitudes to the lodging houses in the suburbs, and these footsteps merged into the other, into the sound of the marching, mailed feet of the robot children. Now, in this terrible swelling army, the Archbishop saw an extension of the child murder that is pursued quietly in England. The murder of the innocents, planned in tender whispers behind flowered curtains, carried out behind white walls and roses. Here, in these legions of children whose souls were murdered, it was extended. It was the same sin, yet still not committed openly, frankly, still camouflaged in organization, hypocrisy, discipline, ideology, even a certain crude Wagnerian sentimentality. The murdered face must not be looked upon. Man must not be asked to look at what he has done, because the little dead face against which the whole of civilization is hammering is the blue, pinched face of a stillborn child. Therefore, war must come. Perhaps when it came, it would fling it out on the screen, even of the willfully blind world's vision. Perhaps men would see it for what it is only when it scorched their own living flesh with material flame, only when it was smeared across their pavements in their own blood. And now, in his dream, the Archbishop saw the army of Nazi youth coming up towards the young Christ on the cross, facing him, looking at him with unseeing, opaque blue eyes, staring unseeing on the face of the Christ. Lovely children with slender bodies, with rose-petal cheeks, with small pink mouths and white bleached hair, silver, gold, the light playing on their helmets, the light glittering on their bayonets, the light flashing on their marching feet, children swinging along in perfect time, in terrible unison, coming up to the young Christ on the cross, their metallic tread ringing out the accompaniment to the cry on their choral lips, Krieg, Krieg, Krieg! War, war, war! Christ saw them with wide open, all-seeing eyes. He saw them advancing. He saw them advancing across 2,000 years. He could have come down from the cross. He could have called the legions of the angels to his standard. But he remained on the cross, nailed to a plank of wood, and he did not draw back a hand to cover his heart. A cry went out from the Archbishop's soul to the crucified Christ. Eternal innocence, child of the Father, did you see the children advancing when you hung on the cross? Did the steel tramp of their feet ring in your ears? Was the drumming in your ears in the hours of death turned to the shout of Krieg, 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 hammering on your bloodless brain, drowned only in the dark storm of the waters of death, the torrent inside the little shell, trying in vain to burst through the crown of thorns as you bowed your head and died? And as if it was in answer to his prayer, another procession of children came into his dream, walking slowly with infinite dignity, one by one, each one alone, each alone walking in the pure majesty of childhood, the holy children of our times, gentle, devoted peasants, and grave, sweet patricians, children stepping softly on blameless, naked feet, almond-eyed children, brown from caressing suns, Melanie and Maximine of La Salette, Francisco, Jacinta, and Lucia of Portugal, Bernadette Soubirous, and behind them, Anne de Guines with her wistful face and her deep lace collar, and Guy de Fontgalande in his sailor suit, with his thick golden fringe and his cry in the teeth of war, Je veux faire connaître le petit Jésus dans le monde entier. That's something like, I will make the love of Jesus into the world. Something like that. With that cry in his ears, the Archbishop awoke. And the wonder of the children who loved God remained in his consciousness like a light shining in his breast. He whispered, Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, dona nobis pacem. And then, indulging his habit of talking out loud to himself, he said, Lord, who knows? Perhaps while your old men and your theologians and bishops and politicians and scholars wrestle in vain with the angel, your battles are fought and won in the nurseries. And suddenly, with the same surprise that we experience when we first see an open daisy in the field, the expected, the known, the ever with us becomes sudden, unexpected, new. The Archbishop remembered Willie Jewell. The whole wearisome problem of Riverside returned, not now in all its adult intricacy, but in the sharp, simple vision of a child dying and a childlike old man watching from heaven. The Archbishop got up slowly and knelt down. After all, he was going to take Father Perivale's advice. He was going to risk St. Peter's view of it and ask Father Malone to hold his hand, not to work the miracle. Such an interesting story. He knelt there, an ascetic, beautiful old man of silver, clothed in purple, with a ring like a drop of blood on his finger. The shadow of his thick white hair on his forehead like the shadow of a crown of thorns. "Father Malone," he said softly, "do you hear your bishop speaking to you, Father Malone?" And he felt quite sure that he did hear, that the old man was close, leaning out of heaven. He visualized him, not indeed with theological accuracy, but with childlike simplicity, kneeling at the door of heaven and removing his battered hat when he heard his bishop's voice, his umbrella filled up with stars hanging over one arm, the other arm lifted, cupping his ear with his hand as he leaned forward to hear his bishop's request. "Father Malone, it is Archbishop Creasy speaking. You've caused a lot of trouble here, Father, with your holiness. We can't know God's purposes as well as you know them now, Father, but we can't help seeing and thinking and wanting from our own poor simple angle. And it seems to me, Father, that the little child's death is in the world's redemption. And a miracle from you just now, Father Malone, if you will forgive me for saying so, tending towards imprudence." Thus the Archbishop made his act of faith in the sanctity of Father Malone. It was 3:00 in the afternoon, on the last day of the novena, the precise hour at which Willie Jewell died. What a compelling story. I love the Archbishop character. Okay, the next chapter is called The Magnificat of Martha. Martha is Willie's mother. So we get to go back to Riverside. Oh boy. What a beautiful story. Hope to finish it soon. Do a couple more chapters next week. Yes. Thank you.